Okay, so good evening, everybody. My name is John Alessi. I'm the Senior Transportation Planner in the Department of Planning and Community Development here for the town of Arlington. Thank you for attending tonight's Complete Streets Prioritization Plan meeting. I'm really looking forward to the discussions we'll be having here tonight because complete streets are streets for everyone, regardless of who you are or how you get to where you need to go. And complete streets will help enrich Arlington as the vibrant community that it is today. So next slide, please. So before we get started, I'd just like to go over some of the, can we go? Thank you. I'd just like to go over tonight's Zoom protocols and reminders. So comments and questions are welcome in the chat, but we may not be able to respond to all of them during the meeting. To ask a question during the designated Q&A times of breakout rooms, you can either 1, raise your hand using the Zoom reactions button, or 2, type your questions into the chat. And finally, we'd like you to stay curious and be mindful. Be kind to presenters, staff, and participants, and please remain muted unless you have been called on to ask a question. Next slide, please. So now let's dive into the plan overview. So the final plan will identify at least 15 street improvement projects in Arlington that will expand safe and accessible options for all travel modes, including walking, biking, transit, and vehicles for people of all ages and abilities. So all the projects included in the prioritization plan update will be eligible for funding through the Massachusetts Department of Transportation's Complete Streets Funding Program. And if you look at the project timeline, since fall 2020, we have conducted a site visit with the project team, released a survey for the public in order to get some feedback, conducted survey analysis, developed a project list, also developed project sketches and cost estimates. And now today we are at the June 2023 public meeting to go over the plan. Next slide, please. So tonight I'm joined by the rest of the project team, including Mara Holland from the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and Elizabeth Flanagan and Rachel Grosso from Kittleson Associates. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to hand it over to Mara Holland with MAPC, who's going to give an overview of Arlington's existing conditions. Take it away, Mara.
Thanks, John. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Mara Holland. I'm a senior transportation planner at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, which is the regional planning agency serving 101 cities and towns around the greater Boston region. And we are a consultant for the town of Arlington working on this Complete Streets Prioritization Plan update. So to kick off this project, we looked at a lot of previous planning efforts and planning efforts in progress in the town of Arlington. So we wouldn't be duplicative in our efforts in creating this prioritization plan. Some of the major plans that we reviewed include the Complete Streets Prioritization Plan that was previously developed in 2017. The prioritization plan is able to be updated every 3 years. So this is an update that's happening right now. We also looked at Connect Arlington's Sustainable Transportation Plan that was developed in 2021 and has a lot of really wonderful analysis and information that we're able to pull from for this project. We also looked at the Minuteman Bikeway Planning Project that was just completed last year, as well as a few other really relevant plans within the town that are listed here. In addition to previous planning efforts, we also conducted a site visit in December 2022. It was very cold, but it was a really great opportunity for us to be able to see some really key challenges within the town and some great opportunities, like the brand new high school, which is amazing in Arlington. And as John mentioned, we also put together a public survey that was released earlier this year that I'll talk a little bit about some of those survey results tonight. So the next few slides go over some of the information that was put together for the Connect Arlington Sustainable Transportation Plan that we use to think about some of the priorities for this plan. Here you'll see an overview of some of the sidewalk conditions in Arlington. First of all, the sidewalk coverage in the town is very expansive. All the lines that are in purple are considered in excellent condition. The lines in green are in good condition. Yellow is fair and red is poor. For the vast majority of the major connector streets in Arlington, the conditions of the sidewalk are in excellent or good condition. And many of the sidewalks in more of the neighborhood areas in Arlington are in fair condition, but still great to have in a lot of the neighborhoods. We also looked at the bike network, both the existed and the recommended bike network within the town. All of the solid lines are existing facilities, and all of the recommended facilities that have not yet been built are in the dotted lines. So you can see that the bike network really follows a lot of the major connector roads within Arlington. Also, we looked at many of these locations as well for improvements to include in this prioritization plan. This map shows the safety improvement focus areas that were identified in the Connect Arlington Sustainable Transportation Plan. These are areas that have been identified because they've been crash sites, because they have infrastructure that needs upgrading, things like that. And so these areas also were significant points that we looked at for areas of improvement that we could include in the prioritization plan list that we've been creating. We also, one of the criteria for the prioritization plan is thinking about improving areas within environmental justice communities. And Arlington has a number of environmental justice communities within the town. Most of them follow Mass Ave and are just north of Mass Ave. And so these areas also have a number of projects that we've considered in the plan. And this is one of the evaluation criteria for projects as well. Some other pieces in some of the previous plans that we wanted to make sure that we highlighted while we were thinking about putting this list together, and then the elements as well, the design elements that we were going to include in these projects. Accessibility improvements was something that was mentioned in numerous plans, including the ADA accessibility plan. Safe routes to school projects were something we definitely wanted to consider about how those could be incorporated into the plan. As we know, a lot of students do walk to school in Arlington. Also, electric vehicle charging is something that's greatly being expanded in our region and throughout the country. So we wanted to be conscious of that. And then low impact and green design interventions, including things like rain gardens and more trees, were also important pieces that we looked at in our design interventions. So earlier we mentioned we did a survey, and we had a great response from Arlington residents. I think the survey was open for just a couple of weeks and received 1,200 responses from Arlington residents, which was really fantastic. The goal of this first survey was to provide overall feedback about people's experience using different modes of travel in town, which include walking, biking, taking the bus, driving, and then other micromobility modes as well. We also asked folks to help us identify specific streets and intersections to consider as part of this project list. And that was incredibly helpful for us to think about what are some of the top priorities that the town has for improvements in certain areas. We'll also be creating a second survey, which will be much shorter, that will be available after this meeting, potentially next week, and will help us to identify how this list that we put together can be prioritized by all of you. So that will be really wonderful to have your responses to that survey as well. And you can find that on the town's website soon. And as we mentioned earlier, the final list will incorporate at least 15 street improvement projects. I think now we have about 18 to 20 on the list right now, which is a great list for thinking about safety improvements, accessibility improvements, and those projects will all be eligible for MassDOT funding if they're included in the plan. So in terms of who responded to the survey, 95% of the respondents were Arlington residents, which was wonderful to hear, directly from all of you what your thoughts are. The majority of folks who responded were ages 35 and up. And more than half of the respondents had vulnerable road users living at home, which included children, seniors, people who were not English speaking as their first language, etc. And so that was really important that we heard from those folks to make sure that the infrastructure changes that we implement are safe for everyone who's going to be using the street. So I wanted to just highlight a couple of the questions that we asked and some of the responses here. One of the questions we asked was, how do you typically travel within Arlington? And so you can see the distribution here, 35%, which is our largest percentage here, are people drive their personal vehicle around Arlington. 30% of people walk, 15% of people bike. So those are our top three categories. The next question we asked was, if conditions within Arlington were safer, more efficient, or easier, any of those sort of like better conditions, how would you choose to travel on a regular basis? And I think this is really important to note that between the last question and this question, 14% less people would drive their personal vehicle if conditions were better in Arlington. 3% more would ride public transit and 11% more would bike, which is really wonderful because that also means less traffic congestion in Arlington. It means better air quality. And it means that more people have an opportunity to get around the way that they would want to. We also asked what connections are people wanting to connect to via walking, biking, rolling, etc. And some of the main pieces that people wanted to connect to were the Minuteman Bikeway, which is not surprising as that's a really incredible asset in Arlington and now connects all the way into Boston through the Somerville path, which is fantastic. To schools, to business centers and grocery stores were all places that people really wanted to get to via walking, biking, rolling, and the bus. Some challenges that residents face when taking these modes. For example, walking or rolling, no sidewalks or lack of connected sidewalks, uneven or broken sidewalks, taking the bus, long wait times we heard was probably the biggest thing for anyone who's taking the bus. Biking, lack of connected or continuous bike lanes to the places that people want to go, limited or no protected bike lanes in some areas. And driving, the biggest thing that we heard from folks was unmaintained roadways. We also asked people if there were specific streets that you think Arlington should prioritize for complete streets improvements. And not surprising, the vast majority of people mentioned Massachusetts Ave, as that's the main connector street through Arlington. Other streets included Park Ave, Broadway, Summer Street. And these, again, are all pretty major thoroughways within Arlington that folks really want to see multimodal changes enhanced. This map I found incredibly helpful that all of you are able to give your feedback in a visual way. We asked people to click on up to 5 intersections that you would like to see Arlington prioritize for complete streets. That red border is the outline of the town of Arlington. And you can see this is a heat map, so that that red dot up in Downing Square is the place that people click to the most, and then the sort of yellow, orange, and even green areas are other places where we had a lot of people click on as areas of concern, areas they wanted to see changed with multimodal improvements. So we'll just take a quick pause here. We're going to take a quick questions and try to provide a few answers on some of those existing conditions pieces. At this time, we'll just go to the chat to ask if anybody has any questions, to please put those in the chat. And then at our next opportunity for questions and answers, we'll ask people to also ask verbal questions as well as chat questions. So if you have any questions about these existing conditions, I'm going to go to Rachel to see if she has any questions that she's seen in the chat that she'd like to flag for us.
Hey, Mara. Thanks for this. In the chat, we have had some chatter happening, mostly comments. There was one question from Mark Kaplan, excuse me if I'm saying that wrong, Why survey residents on what road treatments they consider safest when crash reduction factors are available in a database. Do you want to speak to why we would ask people what kind of safe treatments they'd like to see in their community?
I think in general, we asked people about like complete streets treatments in general. And I think we are interested in knowing what priorities people have for these types of improvements, especially what multimodal improvements people are interested in and where people want those improvements. And so we wanted to build this list with both data from previous plans and from information that we have available that's more objective data, as well as feedback from residents, so that we would have both of those pieces to pull together a list that was appropriate for town residents.
I'll also add to that, Mara, saying that although crash data is extremely helpful towards knowing where the most risky safety issues are, it's also good to know kind of the conditions that people don't feel safe, maybe like walking or biking. So there may not be a crash there, but a specific roadway might not feel safe and might contribute to people not wanting to, use it to walk or bike or take transit or things like that.
Definitely. I also think there are some questions in here just regarding the frequency with which pavement markings are refurbished and roadway pavement is redone. And I know that's not necessarily the focus of this meeting, but perhaps, John, you can speak a little bit to those kind of maintenance concerns that definitely affect people walking and biking as well.
I can try to, as in the planning department. So unfortunately, representatives from the Department of Public Works were not able to join this evening. That's a question I'd have to double check with them to see how, the process through which they select different crosswalks to repaint throughout the town.
Sounds good.
So if the person who asked that wants to follow up with me afterward, I'll have my contact information. Sorry.
No worries. Thank you. We have a couple of other questions about the actual Complete Streets funding program that I think we might better address a little bit later in our presentation. But Scott Smith did ask if we could please share the presentation on the town website. And I think this is a softball, so I'll take it. It definitely will be shared.
We'll have the recording present online, we'll have the presentation and the survey all coming out at the same time. So that will be released soon.
Okay, I'm not seeing many other questions on our existing conditions, but lots of thoughts about potential treatments and projects. So I think maybe we should move along.
Great, thank you, Rachel. I'll hand it to John to kick us off with the overview about the projects that we put together.
Right, thanks, Mara. So in a moment, we're going to review the 18 projects listed on the Complete Streets prioritization plan that we have today. So, so to develop this list, we have reviewed existing conditions in previous plans that Mara has pointed out, like Connect Arlington, the Minuteman Bikeway Planning Project. We've conducted site visits, we released the public survey, we analyzed the results, we assessed the near to medium term feasibility of projects, and also integrated some of DPW, DPCD's, and APD's priority projects. And that's Department of Public Works, Department of Planning, Community Development, and Arlington Police Department, if you don't know. So some of the major changes you'll see with these projects include improvements for biking, walking, and bus connections, curb bump outs to slow traffic and enhance safety for all road users, more crosswalks or better connections across busy streets, and safety changes at high crash sites. So I'd also like to note before we look at the projects that not all of the projects identified in the resident survey are on the list, and some areas of the town have less projects than others. The town is discussing internally how we can plan improvements for these intersections and corridors outside of the Complete Streets plan. So we'll hopefully be sharing information regarding other projects in the future. But tonight, we'd like to know how we should prioritize the 18 projects that we have right now. What rises to the top and what should we focus on in the near term? So with that being said, I'm going to pass it off to Liz from Kittleson to review the project list. And afterward, they will answer any questions you have about the projects themselves. But we will be having breakout sessions afterward in smaller groups where we will be able to share comments. So again, we'll review the projects, then answer questions, and then in the breakout rooms, I'll also share a link to the project overview map so that we can kind of look at it a little bit more in depth. So with that, Liz, I'll hand it off to you.
Thanks, John. So my name is Liz Flanagan with Kittleson and Associates, and we've been supporting the town and MAPC with thinking through some initial concept ideas for some of these projects. So this list of projects that you see, there's 18 in total, and this is a mix of some projects that the town was actually already thinking about internally, and then some additional new projects that we've been supporting that kind of came to fruition from that public engagement heat map that Mara presented earlier. So looking at some of those hotspots and identifying what types of improvements could be provided. So I won't read through this entire list of projects, but we do generally have these broken down into kind of 4 sections. So Northwest, Central, and South. So in the North section, we have some projects along Mass Ave at Dundee Road and Paul Revere, and that's right by the Trader Joe's and the Walgreens and that access point to the Minuteman Bikeway. And for each of these projects in the project key, you can see we've got icons for which kind of modes or targets are being taken into consideration for the project. And so when you see pedestrian, that could include sidewalk improvements or new sidewalk connections. It'll also include updating curb ramps for accessibility and repainting crosswalks to be high visibility. It could also include other crossing improvements like curb extensions or beacons. Bike improvements, that includes bicycle lanes, intersection treatments, and a variety of buffered, parking protected bike facilities. When you see the car icon, that's referring to traffic calming. So that's anything that can slow vehicles on the roadway network and really just make a more adhere to Complete Streets principles. And so that means making intersections more tight so that turning movements are slower. It means encouraging slower speeds on straightaways and corridors. It can also include things like horizontal or vertical deflection. Transit improvements for this study would be fairly minor, but there are a few transit supportive strategies that could be implemented, such as right-sizing bus stops, which is basically just painting the bus stop at a length that matches MBTA standard guidance, and that allows buses to pull in and out more efficiently. Or it could involve accessibility improvements at bus stops as well. And then the last category of projects are open space. So often when we're doing intersection tightening or curb extensions, that also provides the opportunity to do some landscaping or install a rain garden or find ways to incorporate open space into these projects. Great, so just at a high level, we do have a few projects along Mass Ave, as I mentioned, at Paul Revere and Dundee, and then also at Mass Ave and Park Ave. And then we have a series of projects going down Park Ave all the way from Downing Square, which is that 6-leg intersection of Bow Street, Lowell Street, Park Ave, and I think one other street name. And that goes all the way down south towards the Turnpike. So a series of bicycle improvements, as well as numerous intersection traffic calming and pedestrian safety crossing improvements. And then actually, if you want to go to the next slide, we'll highlight the next area. Okay. So in the kind of south portion of town in East Arlington, there are projects to do improvements at grade crossings for the Minuteman Bikeway, also intersection crossing improvements. And then we'll talk a little bit more right by Thompson School, we'll actually show a few example concepts. So we'll talk about that project more. Next slide. Great. Then in the central area, we also have a few Minuteman Bikeway crossing improvement projects at Mill Street, Water Street, and Mass Ave. And then on Gray Street, sidewalk crossing improvements, as well as a sidewalk extension where there's a gap and upgrades to the sidewalks, as well as traffic calming. And then also Mass Ave from Bartlett Ave to Academy. So that's just north of the Pleasant Street kind of Mystic major intersection. And that could include, again, some traffic calming, crossing improvements, shortening pedestrian crossing distances, and seeking to incorporate bike facilities to really build out that continuous Mass Ave corridor. Next slide. And then I did kind of already touch on these as part of the Park Ave corridor, this series of mostly pedestrian crossing improvements, traffic calming improvements, and then also a couple examples of transit supportive strategies. So accessibility and thinking about stop locations, which would require coordination with the MBTA and right sizing of stops. Next slide. So we're going to talk through just a couple examples of concepts. And I do want to iterate that these are preliminary. These are mostly to test kind of what are the opportunities for complete streets improvements? Does it fit? Is there space? What can we do at these locations to start generating these project ideas? And that allows us to get a sense of the cost as well as the construction timeline so that it can be plugged into the MassDOT plan, which is a funding program and has a set cap for implementation funding. So this project is in East Arlington. It's at River Street, Broadway, and Bates, and then Warren Street kind of cuts diagonally through. We're showing that green space that's actually roadway now. And so this angled intersection creates this triangle of landscaping in the middle and a really skewed intersection at Warren Street and Broadway. And so that means that you've got a wide intersection that is a little bit, it's a redundant leg of the overall intersection. You're encouraging higher vehicle speeds, making that, that wide angle turn. And the pedestrian sidewalk network is not necessarily in line with desire lines because it doesn't continue on Broadway. So this project is proposing closing off that redundant leg of Warren Street. This would require reassessing the signalization at Warren Street and River Street. We're also considering daylighting at Warren Street and River Street for better visibility of vehicles turning out of Warren Street. This would allow the extension of the sidewalk both along Broadway and River Street. And then some of the other things that we're considering as part of this, of course, would be upgrading all of the curb ramps within the project limits so that they're ADA compliant, upgrading any sidewalk that needs to be upgraded, repainting crosswalks. And we would also propose installing new crosswalks across Broadway at Bates Road and River Road, Harlow Street, which is just at the bottom of the screen there, which would connect two reciprocal MBTA bus stops. And then also at Everett Street, which connects pedestrians to Thompson Elementary School and the field that's right there. So this project would greatly expand that open space and provide some really interesting opportunities for placemaking. The initial cost estimate is $2 million. So this would be a project that would require some additional funding, either from state, federal, or other sources or local. Next slide. Okay. So this is Mass Ave at Dundee Road and Paul Revere. So that's, again, by the Trader Joe's, the Walgreens, and that staircase access point to the Minuteman Bikeway. For this project, Paul Revere Road and Dundee, they both have fairly steep inclines heading down towards Mass Ave at this location, and wide turning radii, which again can promote vehicle speeding, and the angles of the intersection make it harder for drivers to see pedestrians waiting to cross and create those really long crossing distances. So this project proposes tightening both of those intersections with a fairly large curb extension. There is currently, in that darker brown, you can see a bit of an extension that's scored concrete, so basically like rumble strip concrete. So this would propose reconstructing that as a grade separated curb extension, and that also allows some opportunities for landscaping, rain gardens, or other stormwater management strategies. The project proposes reconstructing non-compliant curb ramps, reconstructing poor sidewalk on Paul Revere Road, as well as potentially installing rectangular rapid flashing beacons or RRFBs across Mass Ave at both Dundee and Paul Revere Road, given the high demand of pedestrian access to those locations on the north side of Mass Ave. And then lastly, the project proposes right-sizing the MBTA bus stops with pavement markings and installing bike lanes on Mass Ave, again, trying to build out that continuous bike corridor. We know that's an important link in Arlington. So there's opportunity for that to be partially parking protected, and then at the curb extension, fully protected. Next slide. All right, and then the next project that we're going to talk about is Park Ave from Wollaston Ave to Downing Square. So Park Ave has bike lanes west of Wollaston Ave, but these facilities don't continue east to Mass Ave or to the Minuteman Bikeway, both of which are major bike commuter routes. So this project proposes extending those bike lanes from Wollaston Street to Downing Square, connecting people to those important corridors. The project also includes traffic calming at the Wollaston Ave and Paul Revere Road intersection with Park Ave, and we'll zoom in on that a little bit. I know this is very small scale right now. And then upgrading and replacing curb ramps and crosswalks, as well as doing curb extensions at the Wollaston Ave and Paul Revere Road intersection. So if you go to the next slide. We can zoom in a little bit on what that could look like at two locations. So in between Paul Revere Road and Mass Ave, we're thinking about having parking protected bike lanes, and we could do that by essentially just shifting the angled parking in a little bit and achieving 6-foot bike lanes with a 2-foot buffer, and then maintaining the current 16-foot parking stalls and 2 11-foot travel lanes. And we're also able to maintain the turning lanes at Mass Ave. Next slide. And then zooming in a little bit more closely to that Paul Revere Road and Wollaston Ave intersection with Park Ave, just showing the bike lanes that are able to be continuous through there. And then thinking about a raised median or hardened center line, which would essentially restrict the movement, the through movement on Paul Revere Road to reduce that skewed through movement and simplify the intersection greatly. So I think at this point, if you go to the next slide, we're going to take another break for questions, and I'll pass it back to Mara.
Thanks, Liz. So at this point, we'll do both verbal questions. If folks want to unmute themselves, you can use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen, and we can, and I'll ask Rachel to unmute you. Also, if there's any additional questions in the chat, Rachel, maybe we start with any questions that have not yet been answered, and then we can take any verbal questions if folks want to raise their hand, and then we can unmute you.
Sure thing. So I think one great one that we heard, John actually responded to this in the chat, but I think it definitely bears repeating. Sarah had asked, what's the best way to advocate for improvements if they're not on the project list? And so breakout rooms was one of the answers, but I just wanted to give the opportunity if there are any other ways to get in touch with the project team.
I will say that at the end of this, we'll have my contact information and John's contact information, so folks can get in touch with us if they have any additional comments or questions related to the project.
Great, thanks. One other from the chat that Adam asked, I think this is for you, Liz. Is there any part of Project E, Wollaston to Downing Square, that improves the connection to the Minuteman?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we're extending, as part of this proposed project, the bike lanes to Downing Square, and then to get to the Minuteman Bikeway, you do have to turn onto Bow Street to make that actual at-grade connection to the Minuteman, because it's Park Ave is elevated above it. So as part of the extent of this project, we didn't go chase it all the way to the Minuteman, but I do believe there are some additional access point recommendations for that location in the Minuteman Bikeway planning project. So I don't know if that fully gets at your question, but.
Great, thanks. Mara, I think this one is for you. Christopher asked, can you comment on why there are so many projects on Park Ave and so few in the Broadway-Warren corridor? That definitely links back to our existing conditions.
I can touch.
Yeah, I was going to say, John, can you talk a little bit about the Broadway piece?
I can touch upon that, yes. So as I mentioned before, there are intersections and corridors that the town doesn't have on this list tonight, but is looking at a little bit more in depth for potentially corridor-wide improvements. Broadway is on our radar right now as a corridor that needs a little bit more of a general corridor overlook and less smaller projects. And I can also, so that's something that we're kind of speaking about internally right now. And we are also, in terms of Park Ave, there were many projects that have been already explored already by DPW. So since some of that work has already been included, we're putting those projects on this list because those projects have already been studied and available to be on the as part of the plan.
Great, thank you. Susan Stamps, I saw your hand go up, so if you would like to unmute and ask your question.
Hi, hi, thanks a lot. These look like great projects. As I am in a group in East Arlington that is very concerned about the speeding cars on the so-called ladder streets between Mass Ave and Broadway. A child was actually hit on one of those streets a few months ago, and all we want is traffic calming measures. We don't need the streets widened or narrowed, or those might be nice, but just have traffic calming measures. And I'm wondering if you have thought about including some smaller projects like that in your scope of work. These are very large projects, it looks like, that you're talking about, but it doesn't help a whole lot for Broadway to be a lot safer when it's really hard to get there safely or to live in the area safely. So I'm just wondering what your comments are on that. Thank you.
I can take that question. Susan, thank you for sharing that. So as part of this plan, we did look at more, we looked at projects that were a little bit more intensive, as you alluded to. But I'll say right now, I'm about a month and a half into my new role with the town. And what you noted with Broadway and those ladder streets, I've heard that those are issues and are in need of traffic calming improvements. So although projects like that aren't included on this current list right now, that's something that I'm starting to kind of understand more in my role. And I'm trying to kind of think of ways that we can implement projects like that. So unfortunately, they can't be included on the plan tonight, but that's something that I'm personally looking at in my role. And if you want to get in touch with me, please do to discuss ideas. I'd be happy to chat.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Susan. Next, I see Philip Goff has his hand raised. You can unmute to ask your question.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Rachel. Appreciate it. Phil Goff. I live on Grafton Street in East Arlington. I'm the co-chair of Everywhere Arlington Livable Streets Coalition, a townwide advocacy group. You had mentioned, I forget who it was in the presentation, and mentioned that in some of the lead up to the planning here and recommendations, you looked at the various planning efforts that were relevant. Certainly the Connect Arlington plan, the Minuteman Path plan recently, and some others. Did you happen to take a look? I have a feeling the answer is no, but if you haven't taken a look at the recommendations that were signed by over 500 Arlington residents, that the EELS Coalition developed a petition. We developed a series of, it was called the Mass Ave Vision Zero plan. It was a series of short, medium, and long-term recommendations for pedestrian, bike, and transit safety improvements and access improvements on Mass Ave. Again, it was about a year ago. There's, a dozen or more recommendations, short, medium, and long-term. And again, the petition was signed by over 500 Arlington residents, presented to the select board and, copied to TAC and everyone else. So if you haven't looked at that, and I'm happy to send it to the team if needed. I hope you look at that. There are a lot of good ideas in there. Some are, pretty simple, again, short-term or medium-term, others longer. For Mass Ave, where, as I'm sure you and everyone knows, multiple people have died, pedestrians and bicyclists, over the last handful of years. So I'm a little disappointed to see that there wasn't a little more emphasis on Mass Ave in that previous map, but perhaps that's one of the corridors along with Broadway that will be emphasized. But anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there, and I hope you can take a look at the recommendations that were in the Mass Ave Vision Zero proposal from the EELS Coalition.
Thanks, Philip. Again, I'm new, so I'm not aware of this, but at the end of the presentation, I'll have my my contact information. I'd appreciate it if you could send that to me so I could review it, and feel free to chat with me about any of the ideas in that petition. Okay,
will do. I've got your email. Thanks, John.
Sounds good. Thanks, Philip.
Yeah, thank you. One question that came up in the chat, not seeing any more hands raised right now, was, sorry, just looking through my notes to find it. Could we identify some small projects that fix gaps in the network, such as improving the pedestrian crossing of Medford Street at Warren Street? Mara or Liz or John, do you want to address identifying smaller projects than what's included in the project list for this plan?
I can speak to that as well too. So right now we have our list kind of, we have a list of projects right now, and the purpose tonight is to understand how residents feel about this project list, to see what rises to the top, which ones people want to prioritize. But with that being said, if there are projects that are missing from this list, please get in contact with me or someone else on the project team, either during the breakout discussions, after the meeting, just so that the town can be aware of some of these ideas and areas of concern, so that if not within the Complete Streets plan, it can be addressed through a different project.
Thanks, John. One question that just came through the chat, I think this is definitely relevant to our project list. Park Ave and Mass Ave is already a pretty narrow section of road and often gets backed up with traffic, I think vehicular traffic. Could you please comment on the considerations for adding a bike lane here? Would additional space come from narrowing the sidewalks? I totally agree that bike lanes are needed here, from the commenter. So I think just speaking to reallocating roadway space.
I can take that one. I imagine you're talking about Park Ave north of Mass Ave. It does narrow down quite a bit there, and there's the bridge that goes over the Minuteman Bikeway and the rail corridor. So yeah, We haven't conducted survey, so this is all preliminary concept design, but our understanding is that there would be space for unbuffered, so just traditional 5-foot bike lanes going from where Park Ave narrows to Downing Square. And at the intersection of Park Ave and Mass Ave, it does widen a little bit, so we were able to maintain the turning lane. I think it's a exclusive left and then a through right on Park Ave southbound. So we did try and maintain that. Oh, south of Mass Ave. Yeah. So the extents that we were looking at, it wasn't too problematic. It pinches right at the intersection of Park Ave and Mass Ave. And so we did have to narrow the bike lanes a little bit, but we still wanted to continue them through the intersection. But no, there would not be any consideration of narrowing sidewalks.
Great, thanks. Mara, could you flip back to the map just so folks could get one more look of all of the projects? And if they have any questions while we're all together as a group, ask them now. So these are some of our project examples that if you're just joining, you might not have seen, but we'll have a chance to talk a little bit about them. And this is just a zoom in of the overview of projects maps. And so if there's anyone who has any questions about these that haven't been addressed yet, please feel free to raise your hand and take yourself off mute.
I was also going to wait until the breakout rooms to share this, but I'm going to put into the chat right now the project map overview so that people can look at it on their own devices closely.
Thanks, John. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands raised or anyone off mute. So I think if we're all in agreement, we can continue on in our agenda.
Thanks, Rachel. So next we're going to go into 4 breakout discussions, and this will be an opportunity for all of us to have a verbal discussion together about the project plan, about some of the examples that Liz and Rachel showed us, and the project list as a whole. And we'd also like to ask you about prioritizing these projects. What is most important to you of what we've shared tonight? These breakout rooms will last about 25 minutes. And I'll be taking notes. Each one of the breakout rooms will be led by someone on the project team. And then we'll come back into the main room. We'll share a little bit about some of the summary of what was discussed in the breakout rooms, and then we'll talk about next steps for this project going forward. So when we're ready, I'll ask Tim if he can send us into breakout rooms.
Hello? Hello. Everyone. Join. Okay. Let's see. Okay.
Hi, everyone. I think we're just waiting for a couple of our team members to join. Oh, I see them all. Hi.
All right, hello everyone. So we just had all of our different breakout discussions, and actually, Mara, before we go to the next steps, I was hoping that each of the folks who have been leading these breakout discussions could kind of just like share with the general group right now, maybe 2 key things that came out of the discussions. And I'd be happy to go first. So in our group, there was some excitement about some projects, but we mainly discussed some of the other areas of the town that should be looked at for more corridor-wide improvements, notably Broadway and Mass Ave. And I'm seeing Rachel nodding, so I'm assuming the same discussion came up there. And that's something that I alluded to before. So the Complete Streets program is kind of looking at more smaller scale projects. But as I settle into my new role, these corridors, Mass Ave, Broadway, are on my radar. And internally, we're speaking about ways that we can kind of study them and propose improvements that not only increase safety, but enhance mobility in line with the Complete Streets plan, with Connect Arlington, with the Minuteman Bikeway Planning Project. So those are kind of the 2 things that we discussed in our group. Maybe Rachel, it'd be good if you could go next to kind of reiterate some of the same things or new things.
Absolutely. We had a great discussion. I think we talked a lot about Park Ave and some of the particular intersections along it that feel really dangerous regardless of which mode you're using to access it. And we have some great ideas on how those specific locations can be improved. But overall, I think there's a lot of excitement, John, to your point about some more regional or at least townwide corridor studies for Broadway, for Park Ave, and then some of the spot locations as well. So yeah, a lot of good talk in room 4.
Great. Liz, would you like to go next?
Yeah, so we, as you did as well, had some excitement around a few of the projects. So specifically Park Ave at Paul Revere and Wollaston, Mass Ave at Park Ave, and then also the Minuteman Bikeway at Mass Ave generated quite a bit of discussion. And then the Warren Ave at Broadway intersection improvements that we talked about in the presentation. And then more generally, there was a lot of discussion about just town-wide intersection improvements. So particularly striping crosswalks, just making crossings more visible, making them more safe, particularly on Pleasant Street, and the issue of just not having enough lighting, the fact that people are going about their errands wearing flashing vests when they go around in the colder months of New England. And then other than that, we also had a good conversation about bike facilities, especially on Mass Ave, kind of how are those going to be implemented? Are they going to be facilities that are safe and comfortable for all users, and the challenges that go along with that? And then some of the interactions between the role of Mass Ave as a kind of major corridor for everyone versus the Minuteman, which is high comfort but crowded, and kind of the trade-offs, and acknowledging that the businesses are on Mass Ave, and so people do need to be able to get there safely and comfortably with their kids and other more vulnerable users.
Great, thanks for sharing. And then last but not least, Mara.
Thanks, John. I'll just keep it really brief since I know we're short on time. I think in general, I would repeat some of the things that were already said. We had some interest in smaller scale projects rather than some of the ones that were, or in addition to some of the ones that are listed in our plan. From a prioritization perspective, definitely safety was a big priority for a lot of folks. Thinking about building out the network, something that's politically feasible, that will be able to move forward was important. And then prioritizing open space, especially the project at Broadway, Bates, River Street with the open space was exciting for folks. And then connections to the Minuteman and beyond were also mentioned.
Awesome. So now that we've kind of debriefed on the breakout rooms, Mara, if you could bring up the slides so I could close out. Great. So one moment, please. Yeah, so these are some of the next steps. If you're interested in continuing to follow the Complete Streets prioritization plan, we're going to be releasing a follow-up public survey soon, which will kind of go over some of the projects that we've mentioned tonight and kind of ask residents to kind of rank and which projects they want to prioritize, basically. We will then use some prioritization criteria to rank the projects, and we'll post the final plan to the town website later this summer, with the goal of submitting this plan to MassDOT by September 1st. And when approved, that will allow us to apply for project funding beginning November 1st. So next slide, please. So with that being said, I'd like to thank everyone who participated in the meeting tonight. I want to thank the project team who helped run this meeting. So if any of you would like to continue talking, my contact information is here. And again, thank you all and have a good evening.
Thank you so much. Have a good evening.